Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this screening of Race, the Power of an Illusion, Episode 2, presented by the UC Davis Campus Community Book Project. My name is Megan Macklin, and I serve as a program manager in the Office of Campus Community Relations, where I manage the book project. Thank you for joining. While we meet today in a virtual space, we'd like to begin by reading the following statement that acknowledges the land where UC Davis sits. We should take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are gathered. For thousands of years, this land has been the home of the Patwin people. Today, there are three federally recognized Patwin tribes: Quetzal-Dihi Band of Wintun Indians of the Calusa Indian Community, Quetzal-Dihi Wintun Nation, and Yota-Dihi Wintun Nation. The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. To begin our event, a couple of housekeeping items for our virtual space. Today's event features live captioning from Otter Live Notes. To access the transcript, click on the red live icon on the top left of your Zoom screen. You also can access the live stream by navigating to the link that we'll put into chat. The introduction and discussion portions of today's event are being recorded, and the recording will be made available on the Book Project website. We encourage you to turn on your video during our discussion. It's great, especially for our facilitators to see faces. And throughout the event, you are invited to ask questions or share comments in the chat. The Campus Community Book Project promotes dialogue and builds community by encouraging diverse members of the campus and surrounding communities to read the same book and attend related events. The Book Project, a signature initiative out of the Office of Campus Community Relations since 2002, advances the mission to improve both the campus climate and community relations, to foster diversity, and to promote equity and inclusiveness. Currently in its 20th year, the Book Project in 2021-2022 focuses on the theme of social justice in practice and features How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. Our theme and selection are supported by a year-long program of lectures, workshops, book discussions, film screenings, exhibits, performances, and more. Our program culminates when author Ibram X. Kendi comes to UC Davis on Thursday, March 31, 2022, to speak at the Mandavi Center for the Performing Arts. For more information about the Book Project program, visit our website, where you can find up-to-date event information, registration links, and other resources. We also welcome your involvement, students, staff, faculty, and community members, in selecting the Book Project featured title and in planning our annual program. If you're interested in getting involved with the Book Project, please send us an email or refer to the Book Project website for more information. The film we will watch, Race, the Power of an Illusion, is available for on-demand screening to UC Davis affiliates via the University Library VPN. The Book Project also will host a virtual screening and discussion of the final episode of the film on March 9th. Please refer to the links in chat for more information. And now let's go ahead and turn to our film.
Thank you, Megan.
All right. Well, that was a lot. I think that documentary, or this series of documentaries can be a lot for folks. So we want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to just, make sure you're breathing, and let go of maybe some of the tension. But yeah, Tom, did you want to go ahead and I'll let you share any thoughts that you might have that come up, and then I can share some thoughts that come up for me, and then we can open it up for folks to ask questions or share comments?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think that even more so than the first one, this, as you said, was covered a tremendous ground. I mean, I was thinking about it. It was in many ways most of or a lot of the highlights that I talk about when I teach both History 17A and 17B. At least the first half of 17B, there was a lot to cover there. Several centuries. I think that kind of at least, well, one of the points I think that this second film did really well, that I think is really important and maybe is lost if you haven't studied U.S. history to the extent, to a great extent, was that you cannot understand U.S. history without understanding Native American history. And we saw in several points that the debate over what to do about Native Americans forced people to come to terms with what it meant to be American. Right. And so, it's, I know when I started graduate school, one of the first classes I took was on Native American history. And I felt like, well, that's not really like, I'm an American historian, like, why would I take Native American history? And, fortunately, it became very clear to me over several years of studying American history that the two, just, you can't separate the two. And then the other thing that I would maybe add to the story, particularly the early part of how race was developed in the United States in particular, was the need for labor, the differences that seemed apparent between white and Black people. But there's also that the understanding kind of the racial ideology that developed in the United States was very much in contrast or on the backs of Black women, right? In particular, they're what Jennifer Morgan, who wrote a fantastic book about this, Laboring Women, wrote about. It was the dual kind of function of Black women, which was both their labor kind of that they performed the same as men in fields or as slaves, but also their reproductive labor. And the writings of early white Europeans commented on the Black bodies of women, helped them develop this idea that they were different, that they were, that they didn't experience pain in labor, for example, so that this is in part what led them to think that they weren't human, they weren't of the same species, and certainly they weren't Christian, because of course that was one of the punishments of Eve, right? Was that she then was forced to endure pain and labor, right? But they saw African Black women that supposedly didn't endure the same sort of pain, so that they weren't of the same species. And then that also meant that they could be treated much more harshly. They could be subjected to the same type of work that the men were subjected to. So there's that added kind of really important point about how the racial ideology developed in the United States was very much, as much not just Black and white, but Black women. And kind of related to that, I would say, as a historian of women and gender, is that you cannot, of course, I think we're much more attuned to this now, you really can't separate the development of one ideology without understanding the other, right? That race and gender are very much, racism and sexism are very much intertwined.
Yes, so absolutely, Tom. I think that was beautifully said, and I think the only thing I would add to that is really sort of like this film does a good job of getting into sort of the scientific practices that have played and really continue to play a role in constructing race, constructing ideas of race. And so you see, we get both science and medicine and how they inform racial assertions or are informed by racial assertions. And I think something that comes up for me really is the pathologization, the pathologizing of Black bodies as genetically inferior, as science informing this racial construct of a Black body as genetically, biologically inferior. And so you get into even sort of the establishment of different medical institutions and scientific institutions doing experiments on the bodies of Black women in the name of science. And I think the production of medical knowledge through sort of these scientific experiments on Black bodies is a legacy. We still see that legacy today, right? So when we think about the pandemic, when we think about COVID-19 and the disparate impact that the pandemic has had, you have institutions over time that have been informed by scientific racism around what it is to treat and support or disregard the Black body. And then you have the Black community who has been really just tortured by scientific racism, who have a distrust of the medical field in a lot of ways, who have a distrust of what could happen with the vaccines when vaccines first rolled out, right? We saw those we saw that distrust in play in the Black community, and we saw that in really all other communities of color as well. And then you have sort of this legacy that I think we're still experiencing today, and that is something that people don't really think about when we have these conversations. You know, we're having them as you know, this is history, this is something in the past, but really these institutions and the founding of knowledge, or the knowledge that was built on scientific racism, still informs a lot of the practices that we engage with today. The UC, the University of California, is not it's not separate from that, right? I think we had, what was it, the Center for the Study and Reduction of Violence came out of UCLA, and that used science and knowledge based on research that was intended to essentially locate the biological causes of violence and locate those biological causes within bodies, within the Black body, within people of color. And so, and that was only in the 70s, right? So these things, we're still very much experiencing a legacy of these things. So with that, I will go ahead and open it up a little bit for questions, comments from folks, what's coming up for folks, or questions that they want to engage Tom and I with. Let's have a conversation. Sherry?
I wanted to say something about what Thomas was saying with regard to the people using science to try and prove the genetic inferiority of, say, African-American female bodies. Yet it troubles me because we're putting a value judgment, right? We're saying they're somehow genetic, sorry, not we. It was being said that they were somehow genetically inferior, except when we wanted heavy labor, right? Except when we wanted somebody to do backbreaking manual labor, and then suddenly, hey, they're the genetic lottery, right? That's the person or the entity we want doing the work. So I think what's frustrating isn't just that historically what science has said, but also just the way people have somehow disassociated in their minds that we want to somehow make ourselves better. So we have to put this other person below us and say that they are somehow genetically inferior, except for when it is advantageous to us. The same thing you made the comment about, and I recall that from, Catechism, that Eve had to bear the pain of childbirth for her sin. And if they then say that African-American bodies don't feel that, then okay, maybe they're not human. I don't quite get that. But the idea again that women are also historically treated as being genetically weak, yet we endure the pain of childbirth, right? So it's like, well, how weak are we if we're actually putting up with things that are pretty physically difficult? The final point, I think, is, and one of the things I'm getting extremely emotional about with the pandemic, I recall a story of an African-American physician, a woman, who died from COVID, precisely because nobody was listening when she was trying to tell them how sick she was. And I think it's especially hits home right now. I happen to have had to have a procedure and had to be put under light anesthesia last week. And because of my red hair, I process anesthesia really fast. And I've woken up before during surgery. So I carry a card with me to remind the doctors, hey, that's just one little minor thing. But to have to go through my entire life, if my skin was a different color, saying, hey, I do feel pain. I do need this, whatever treatment I'm saying I need. And nobody listened. And this woman she was a doctor, for God's sake. Why would we not believe a doctor when they say, I need treatment? So I'll take my little emotional self back and just listen now. Thank you.
Uh, yeah, thank you, Sherry. It is, you know, being a historian and studying this as, your profession, it almost like inures you to the pain sometimes, but it's very real when you read about individual stories or think about them in the collective. And I would just say to your point about like the contradiction, the contradictions are one of the first things that I tell my students to embrace is the contradictions of humans and their ideas. And it's I actually with this point that you're talking about, I encountered this quite a bit in my own research in the early 20th century. I focus on eugenics, which we were introduced to in the first episode. And the late 19th and early 20th century, there was this idea of race suicide, and that in particular it was aimed at anti-immigration, anti-immigrant sentiments, right? That these weaker, less intellectually developed peoples were going to overwhelm the white Anglo population. And I have yet to really read someone of the period say, well, if you're claiming yourself as the superior race, right? As we saw in this film, even, how is it that you are going to be then overwhelmed and destroyed and overtaken by a weaker race? And it's a contradiction. I don't think that can necessarily be explained, that can be explained away. And I think it was the same case in the point that you picked up on.
Other thoughts, questions from folks?
Hi, I have a question. I wasn't able to. My name is Kristen Milliken, and I was wondering. I wasn't able to be present for the entire thing. I kind of had to come in and out at a couple times, but I thought that this was such an exceptional documentary. The way that I mean, I was taking notes here and there, just hearing things certain ways for the first time was just so powerful. As the US becomes more democratic for men, it becomes less so for people of color. And that the idea of the trajectory of the narrative that's imposed or impressed upon Native Americans as like once upon a time they were seen as being redeemable in some ways, or as human, is equatable, but savage, but then how that shifts to like their complete dehumanization at some point, and what the mechanisms are for that are informing that perspective. But I guess so. There was just such a rich documentary. And I haven't seen the first one, which I'm guessing we screened together. And I haven't seen the third one. I did recall seeing like one image of perhaps like an Asian American in there. But did they talk at all? I did hear like one mention of Mexico and Mexicans. But did they talk more at all, like in the other pieces, or maybe perhaps I missed about Asian American and the development of the perception of that? Because as an Asian American, I feel overwhelmingly that one of the primary issues and insidiousness of racism against the Asian American community is the invisibleness of it, and that we are commonly left out of the stories, left out of the demographics, completely left out of the scientific research, even like present day, right? Like to find out after I had gotten the Pfizer vaccine that that it only has an efficacy rate of 70% versus in Asian Americans versus the Moderna vaccine, which had a 90%. I mean, that is scientific racism today, right? Is that like we're so invisible, seen as being such a non-essential, non-remarkable group, or that we're seen as our adjacency to whiteness is inclusive, like that includes us, and that we're in fact not people of color. And so I am very much wondering if like the other parts in the series talk more about that and don't just like flash pictures up occasionally of Asian Americans in this country and how they were treated around the same time period. Yeah, that's my question.
So, and Tom, you might have to help me here too with recalling some of the content from the first and the third film. But I don't recall specifically if they go very deeply into some of the more Asian American related history of the United States. That is a very complex history, and as you know, the film producers are not anymore outside of the operations of racism and the ways that we understand racial dynamics, and that includes how we might view, see or not see or perceive Asian Americans, and as you said, spoke to the history of invisibilizing much of the Asian American experience within sort of the black and white binary. I could go on for that since I taught a little bit of Asian American studies at Sac State, but I'll leave it to Tom and see if he wants to add any more to that before I go into a first year Asian American Studies seminar. Go ahead, Tom.
Well, no, Kristen, I think that you're right that particularly in the second one that there were only flashes, and in particular related to, I think, California's questions or controversies over race. And again, I'm not only a women's historian, but also California is in particular. I work on San Francisco, and so the question of race for me has often been related to California's relationship to Asian populations. But I think that as Christopher is suggesting, the history, the telling, the studying of history has always been very East Coast centric. And so that is often usually meant black and white. And to the extent that someone studies before 1850 Native American, but I think that there is an overlooking to when telling the broad story of American history, as this, I think, episode would suggest that it is, that it doesn't say this is, Eastern American history, it's American history, right? But that it very much focuses only primarily on Black and to a certain extent Native Americans. So I don't think you're mistaken there. The first one, I think, does maybe a little bit better job in that, it's built around a cohort of students that is maybe a little bit more representative of differing racial groups, ethnicities in the United States, but and it focuses more on the kind of the biology question of race, so that it's maybe a little bit less focused on individual groups. And I have yet to see the third one.
I think what I would add is from what you do see in the documentaries, and this is somewhat more implied, is how different communities of color are racialized differently throughout history, right? So you get the Black and brown bodies and their experiences, sort of as Sherry was, I think, alluding to earlier, like, how is it racialized in a way that is advantageous to land owning white settlers, and how are they racialized in a way that is used as an excuse for either removal or destruction, essentially, right? So especially with the indigenous population in the United States, you have the idea of removal. You have laws and policies that are implemented throughout the US that really speak to like, how do we acquire and steal their land? Because we need the land for valuable resources, for gold, silver, agriculture, right? You have the racialization of the Black body as now, once we've acquired the land, how do we use it, right? So you racialize the Black body as labor to pull the resources from that land. And then you have, they spoke very little of this, but they did mention it, sort of the racialization of bodies who are of Mexican origin, right? So the annexation of land, the theft of land from Mexico, essentially, where those, if you look a little deeper into history, you'll see how policies are written essentially to steal land from folks of Mexican origin as well, right? And then those people are also racialized as vagrant. They're racialized as nuisances, as alcoholics. And so you really get to see, as you dive deeper, how law, policies, and institutions very explicitly targeted communities of color. And that's where you get the notions of racialization. That includes also Asian Americans. How did labor policies racialize Asian Americans as either a threat to US labor or a need for US labor? And so those dynamics inform, on the flip side of that, those dynamics have informed who is and is not white. Because if you look at history and you look at all the policies and the institutions that we've established up till now, there isn't really a clear definition of what white is. There's no clear definition of what whiteness is, right? It's always much more about like the other. It's always much more about like that is brown and or Black, right? And so now I'm going off on a tangent, but you get the idea here, right? The idea is within that racial construction, it's always sort of been about constructing the other. It's always about constructing someone else as anything other than white, anything other than being able to access land, access resources. Other thoughts?
Sorry, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate, Megan, you bringing this together, this event together, this panel, the selection of the film. I mean, Thomas, for your comments, and I definitely appreciate Christopher, for your comments about how the narratives shift depending on the objectives of white supremacy, you know, with each targeted population. And yeah, I thank you so much. Thank you so much.
And then I just want to do a time check real quick because it is 2:48, 4:28. So I know that Megan had some closing comments before we let you all go.
Thanks so much, Christopher. Thank you to you and Tom for facilitating that discussion. Really appreciate your insights, your expertise, and breaking down, as you said, Christopher, a pretty heavy film. And I think the thing that really resonated with me is, yes, this is talking about history, you know, in air quotes, but gosh, it seems so relevant to today, to the past year. So I really appreciated both of you for kind of bringing in the context of not only what we would consider history, but also what's going on in our current times. So I just want to share some closing remarks with the group before we end this program. First, hoping that folks can join our next virtual program for the book project on Tuesday, January 25th at 5:30 p.m. Tracy Thomas, who is a CAN community counselor in Student Health and Counseling Services, is going to lead a virtual workshop titled How Not to Break Your Soul in the Pursuit of Social Justice, Values-Based Tools for Preservation and Empowerment. You can register on the book project website, and all are free all are welcome at this free event. Also on the book project website, you will see on our calendar information on the screening and discussion of part 3 of this documentary series. Again, that's going to happen on March 9th, and that also will be a virtual program. Finally, we welcome your feedback on today's event and invite you to complete a brief survey, which you can access via the QR code that you'll see on your screen, and also at the web address that's listed there as well. As an incentive and thank you for your participation, at the end of the survey, you will have an opportunity to enter into a prize drawing for a ticket to see this year's book project featured author, Ibram X. Kendi, at the Mondavi Center on March 31st. Again, thank you for joining us today and hoping that we'll see you at a future book project program.